The cosmos was viscous, silent, and indifferent. The stars scattered across the inky background twinkled in the cold silence as if mockingly looking at a tiny ship that sailed through their vast empty space. The Stellar Whisper spacecraft is quiet and vulnerable, like a lonely swan that has lost its flock. Silence reigned in its metallic depths, broken only by the sound of life, support systems rhythmically lulling the space like the heartbeat of a machine. Captain Dylan Hart sat in his chair, staring at the control screen, which was the only light source in the bridge. The transparent helmet on his head reflected the glare of the indicators, giving his gaze a detachment. But his thoughts were far from the current situation. What the hell happened? The thought haunted him. A simple research flight, an ordinary mission to the edge of the galaxy, suddenly turned into a nightmare. The asteroid rain, which they did not have time to detect, damaged the ship, making it impossible for them to quickly return to base. And now he wasn't alone. His companion in this cosmic solitude was Liriana, a representative of the Scion race. Highly intelligent beings whose arrogance and mystery irritated Dylan from the first meeting. Liriana wasn't just an alien, she was something completely different. Her skin, pale blue, shimmered in the light of the indicators, and her eyes, unnaturally huge and dark, seemed to absorb any light falling on them. She was sitting on the other side of the bridge, immersed in studying the onboard data, with the same detachment with which one might observe an insect in a laboratory.
It was the failure of your crew,
Liriana finally said, her voice as cold as an icy wind. She didn't even look at Dylan when she spoke. Her attention was focused on the holographic interface in front of her.
Human ships have always been too primitive for such voyages.
Dylan grimaced. He was already used to her sarcastic remarks. From the moment her ship crashed and he had to take her on board, their communication had been reduced to short, cold phrases. She looked at him with disdain, as if he was nothing more than a misunderstanding in her perfectly calibrated reality. And although her presence annoyed him, he understood that without her knowledge of complex alien technologies, he would have no chance of coping with the current situation.
Maybe your ships are better, but for some reason you're sitting on mine.
Dylan replied dryly without looking up from his display. He was exhausted, but he tried not to show it. All he wanted was to repair the ship as soon as possible and return to base. The only thing that hindered this plan was damage to the communication and life support system. Liriana didn't answer. Her slender fingers ran over the control panel, calling up the blueprints of the ship, analyzing the damage. For her, human technology was on the level of children's toys. All their systems seemed clumsy and inefficient to her, but despite her contempt, she knew that in order to survive, she had to cooperate. It had been several hours since the ship was damaged, and they were stuck in the middle of nothing. At this stage, the two of them were trying to assess the damage. Liriana, without wasting any words, began working on power supply schemes, while Dylan tried to figure out what could be done with the communication system. Their gazes sometimes crossed, but did not linger on each other. There were brief moments when Dylan found himself studying her face sharp, unusual features too alien for his perception, but at the same time causing a strange feeling of interest, or was it just fear of the unknown? He wasn't sure. It was hard to say what exactly attracted him to this mysterious alien, her self-confidence or her uncompromising attitude. But anyway, he tried to suppress it in himself. Meanwhile, Liriana, working in silence, also stole glances at the captain from time to time. His movements seemed rude to her, and his working methods were clumsy. She couldn't understand how such a primitive creature could lead an expedition. But as she watched him longer, she began to notice something different about him. Perseverance, determination, even in conditions that could have broken anyone else. It made her curious and then annoyed. How could her race, developed in every sense, become dependent on humans? The ship was shaking. From time to time, the engine sounds were amplified, indicating that the situation was continuing to deteriorate. At such moments, Dylan and Liriana exchanged brief glances full of tense silence. All their work was reduced to joint actions, but communication was kept to a minimum. They were both professionals, each accustomed to loneliness in their work. Sometimes the silence was broken only by short phrases.
I will restart the energy module. Check the systems.
Dylan said without waiting for approval.
Make sure your hands don't hurt anything else.
Liriana replied coldly, with a barely noticeable grin that might have seemed like a whim in her alien culture. They continued to work, and with each passing hour, tension built up between them. It wasn't just hostility or antipathy. It was a mixture of fatigue, irritation, but also a growing curiosity about each other. Being alone on the ship made them, despite all the differences, feel a strange connection, forced, but nevertheless real. They weren't friends, but each of them realized that survival depended on how well they could work together. At times, when they almost collided in the narrow corridors of the ship or when working in cramped compartments, their hands accidentally touched, and these moments caused both short bursts of tension, as if from static electricity. It was a strange feeling, not just a physiological response, but something deeper that both tried to ignore. After several hours of silent work, Dylan finally sighed.
We can work here until the end of time, but we won't get out without a proper connection.
He muttered to himself. Liriana heard him, looked up, and for the first time in all this time spoke serious.
Communication is not the main thing. We're running out of oxygen. You probably don't notice it, but I can already feel the level drop.
Dylan frowned.
Decline? Why didn't you tell me earlier?
He looked at the control panel, trying to check the data.
Because I've been looking for a way to fix the pitch all this time. Human systems are too slow in processing data. And if I started explaining to you how it works, we would have suffocated by now.
He ignored her taunt. The situation was worse than he had imagined. The ship's stellar whisper was making dull, metallic moans, as if expressing its dissatisfaction with the current situation. Everything around Dylan and Liriana spoke of the slow approach of disaster. The muffled sounds of operating systems, the darkness that enveloped the corridors due to the disabled backup lighting, and the growing feeling that time was getting shorter. The remaining few working lamps flickered, giving off fragmentary flashes of light, reminiscent of the ominous lights of lighthouses in pitch darkness. Dylan was bent over the power grid panel, diligently studying the ship's schematic. Her condition left much to be desired. The panels were damaged, the wires were worn out, and the life support system was on the verge of failure. He was tired, not just physically, but also mentally. His gaze was heavy, his movements slowed down, but at the same time his mind did not let him relax. Liriana, mysterious and cold, worked beside him, barely deigning to pay attention to him. Her alien aura acted on Dylan like a sharp knife, dividing reality into two opposites. She and he, two completely different beings, forced to exist in the same space. He didn't know what she was thinking, and in a way it bothered him. She seemed to move smoothly, her hands barely touching the alien panels, drawing strange symbols that Dylan had no idea about. She didn't need explanations, didn't ask how the ship's systems worked, and somehow managed to fix what he considered incorrigible. The corridors of the ship became colder, as if the very steel from which its walls were made was beginning to lose heat. The sharp drop in temperature was a sign that the climate maintenance system was on the verge of collapse. Liriana had noticed this before, but chose not to say anything to Dylan so as not to waste time. She sensed every change in the environment more subtly than a human, but this was not surprising to her. The Cian were known for their sensitivity to changes in temperature, oxygen levels, and pressure. She worked methodically, and despite her coldness, mental activity was bubbling inside her. With each passing second, she understood the human ship better, its clumsy and imperfect systems. And although she did not admire it, she began to respect the desire of people to survive in such harsh conditions. Dylan was silently working on another section of the power grid. The usual engineering logic nagged at him. If they could restore power, they might be able to keep the oxygen supply going longer. He understood that not everything can be solved by force or a brute. Sometimes it took more than that intuition, which, oddly enough, he was beginning to see in Liriana. He couldn't ignore her skills, even though it made him feel even more vulnerable and inferior. They worked in silence, only occasionally exchanging brief glances. Dylan felt his focus slowly shift from the repair to hers. There was nothing strange about her attracting his attention. Complex alien features, graceful movements, but that wasn't what attracted. There was an unfathomable mystery hidden in her eyes, and it made him want to know more. But at the same time, he knew that approaching her was like trying to touch a stark, beautiful, but deadly. They crossed paths in a narrow hallway as Dylan was on his way to check on the oxygen generator. Liriana was so focused on her business that she almost bumped into him, stopping too close for a moment. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them disappeared. There was something in her gaze, cold, but still not completely devoid of emotion. This moment could have lasted forever, but Liriana was the first to turn away.
Your generator is damaged from the inside,
She said, stepping aside to let him pass. Her voice was colorless, as if she was not talking to a living being, but simply passing on information. Dylan nodded.
I know.
He replied shortly before continuing on his way. Despite his confident appearance, he was beginning to doubt inside. The ship's mechanical systems were his element, and he knew them like the back of his hand. But even with his experience and knowledge, the problem seemed almost insoluble. Liriana, with her mysterious knowledge, was something of a lifeline. She was finding solutions that hadn't occurred to him, and that made him angry. He wasn't used to depending on anyone, much less an alien whose contempt was so obvious. They continued to work together. Liriana stood over the control panel, her fingers sliding over it like a pianist performing a complex symphony. Her every move was precise, devoid of any unnecessary emotion. She tried to ignore Dylan's presence, even though she was aware of his every step, every move. He was like an open book to her mind, emotional, rude, straightforward. It annoyed her, but at the same time, it aroused a strange feeling of respect. The ship shuddered again. A dull metallic screech came from the depths of the ship, the sound of the life support system failing again. Dylan, noticing this, quickened his pace, his heart beating faster as he realized that they were wasting precious time. They were moving towards the engineering bay, where the key to their salvation, or to their death, was located. The darkness of the corridors became almost tangible. The dim lighting flickered, casting chaotic shadows on the walls and floor, and in these shadows their figures seemed even more alien and distant from each other. But paradoxically, their invisible bond was getting stronger by the minute. Working side by side, they were forced to understand each other better. Dylan was silent, concentrating on laying cables and checking connections. Liriana moved beside him, making her imperceptible adjustments, which he noticed only casually, but each time he realized that she was one step ahead of him again. They were like two gears of the same mechanism, completely different, but forced to rotate together to make the system work. And so they got to the emergency generator. Once in front of the massive panel, Dylan assessed the condition of the device. He could see that it was damaged and in need of major repairs, but looking at Liriana, he realized that they did not have time. She silently came closer, standing behind him. He felt her presence, but he didn't turn around. Sighing, he got to work, dealing with the de-energized. Her voice broke the silence.
You're taking too long. A little more and this device will become useless.
Dylan could barely contain his irritation. He knew that, but he didn't like that she was pointing out his weaknesses to him.
If you want to help, help.
He called over his shoulder. Liriana, without saying a word, held out her hand, and at that moment their fingers accidentally touched. It would seem like a small thing, but this contact lasted longer than it could have. Neither of them pulled his hand away immediately. This short moment was full of tension. Each of them felt something, a spark that had been smoldering somewhere deep inside until that time. It wasn't affection or anything like that. Rather, it was the realization that their lives depended not only on their skills, but also on how they interacted with each other. And again, there was silence, only the sounds of working instruments, the quiet buzzing of wires, and the dull hum of the ship. But now that silence was different, not as cold and aloof as before. Something new was emerging in the dark corridors of Stellar Whisper. The ship's Stellar Whisper was sinking into an even more ominous silence. The darkness of its endless corridors became oppressive, as if the very steel of the hull absorbed the tension and fear of its inhabitants. The life support system was slowly but surely failing, and the oxygen supply was running out. But this was not the only source of tension between the two creatures stuck on board. Dylan Hart continued his work in the engine room. His movements became more abrupt and nervous, which betrayed fatigue and latent anxiety. Every new action, every twist of a wrench, or a sharp jerk of a wire reminded him of how close they were to death. He was used to being on edge. It wasn't the first time, but now his own incompetence in alien technology and dependence on Liriana caused him irritation mixed with anxiety. She, in turn, remained focused and calm, or at least tried to look like it. Liriana, as a representative of the Scion race, always acted with cold precision and calculation. Relations for her were nothing more than a biochemical reaction, especially in such extreme situations when it was necessary to think rationally. But no matter how hard she tried to suppress it, something slowly blossomed in her soul that scared her much more than any threat from the outside world. She looked at Dylan as he worked on another knot. His stubbornness, his unyielding will, and despite his obvious physical fatigue, the ongoing struggle for survival caused her mixed feelings. She tried to convince herself that it was just a logical admiration for his persistence. It was supposed to be like this. She used to think of humans as primitive creatures, limited by their weaknesses and fears. But Dylan was different. He did not correspond to her previous ideas, and this disturbed her inner balance. The silence of the engine room was cut by the sound of her voice, low and restrained. The panel is faulty. If you spend a couple more minutes on this connection, the system will simply burn out. She stood behind him, watching his actions and offering her subtle but precise instructions. Dylan nodded silently, knowing that she was right, but his inner pride did not allow him to thank her every time she was more useful. He felt her gaze on him, not cold as before, but still full of distance. It bothered him. He didn't know what was going on in her head, but her presence was so palpable that every time she stood too close, it seemed as if the very air between them thickened. The work continued. Both silently moved from one node of the ship to another, repaired, connected, trying to make the system work at least temporarily. The more time they spent together, the more they felt a strange connection between them. The tension was growing by the minute, but it wasn't just the result of the stress of the situation. Dylan remembered those brief moments when their hands accidentally touched. They were just moments, but they somehow responded strangely inside him. He used to think of her as cold and motionless. Perhaps it was part of her culture or nature, but every minute it seemed to him that something much deeper was hiding behind this coldness, something she's trying to hide as much as he is. But thoughts of survival quickly brought him back to reality. There was less and less time left, and every next step was critically important. They were on the edge, both technically and emotionally. They were working in the hallway where the lights were flashing, casting shadows on the walls. Liriana crouched next to one of the hatches, checking the connection to the power grid, and Dylan stood a little apart, arms crossed over his chest, watching her. He understood that without her they would have given up long ago, but this realization only increased the internal tension. It seemed to him that their every action was a kind of dialogue, but without words, rather a dialogue of their beings and worldviews. Her fingers were quickly going over the control panel when suddenly something blinked. She frowned, and for a moment there was silence between them. Then her voice, low and restrained, broke the silence. "We are losing pressure in the compartment. If we don't do it now, it's over." Dylan didn't answer. He just nodded and moved towards her. They had to work as a unit to save themselves. He stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. It was a necessary movement, but Liriana felt it much more deeply than she had expected. She didn't understand what kind of feeling it was, and maybe she didn't want to understand. She continued to work, and their hands met again as they both reached for the same tool. This time, neither of them pulled their hand away. Instead, they froze, their fingers entwined for a brief moment. Liriana felt her heart, this feeling incomprehensible to her and useless in her world, tremble. She looked up at him. There was something new in her eyes, not cold, but still restrained. Something that could not be expressed in words. Dylan stopped too. He felt the warmth of her touch, and something deep inside made him wonder why it was so important. It was so simple. They were stuck together, two beings from different worlds, and this touch might not mean anything. But the moment their hands touched, all their hostility and barriers seemed to disappear. The silence between them was so deep that it seemed to fill the entire space around them. Only their hearts beating in unison broke the silence. Dylan was the first to break this lull.
We're almost done.
He said trying to bring his mind back to repairs, to technology, to reality. But even his voice sounded different, softer, as if he wasn't sure what he wanted to say. Liriana didn't say anything. She knew that this touch had caused a storm in her that she couldn't control. Her mind screamed that it didn't make sense, that she had to focus on the main thing, survival. But her heart, this weakness that she had tried so hard to suppress, was no longer yielding to her will. They went back to work, but every step felt different now. Every movement next to him, every breath he took was felt more clearly than before. Her heart was pounding too loudly to ignore it. Something had changed, and she couldn't bring it all back. She couldn't go back to the cold and rational self she used to be. When they finished their work, Liriana sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall. Dylan sat down next to her, silently examining the control panel, which was now finally working. They knew that they had done everything possible to repair, but now they could only wait. Wait for the ship to stabilize or for their distress signal to be received. They sat side by side in silence, not saying a word, but there was more meaning in this silence than in any conversation. They both understood that a change had taken place between them, but neither of them knew what to do about it. Liriana closed her eyes, trying to focus on her thoughts. She knew that her race, her culture, would never allow her to feel what she was feeling now, but she couldn't deny it. It was here, next to him, and this man whose tenacity and stubbornness seemed so simple, but now so important. Suddenly she felt Dylan touch her arm, a light, almost imperceptible touch. It was so quiet and careful that it might have seemed random, but she knew that wasn't the case. He didn't know what to say, and he didn't know what she would say. But he understood that they could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. She didn't pull her hand away as she would have done before. Instead, she left it there, feeling the warmth of his fingers on her cold skin. It was a tacit agreement. No words were needed between them to understand that something important had happened. Stellar Whisper seemed even smaller and more vulnerable when its systems began to recover from a prolonged outage. Despite the completed repairs, tension was still in the air. The ship, awakening to life, hummed softly like an old mechanism that had been given a new opportunity to function. The dim light of the lamps no longer flickered, but it was still dark around, as if the very steel of the ship absorbed all the light, preventing it from spreading through endless corridors. Dylan Hart was sitting on the metal floor, leaning against the wall of the engine room. His body was exhausted from the endless work, but his mind was still in a state of heightened vigilance. He stared blankly at the holographic panels in front of him, making sure that everything they had done had really worked. His oxygen readings began to stabilize, and this gave him some relief, but this fact could not drown out his inner anxiety. Their distress call has been sent, but no response has yet been received. They were stuck between life and death, teetering on the edge of the abyss, and they could only wait to see what the arrow of the scales would show. Liriana was nearby. She sat in silence. Her thin body seemed completely motionless, but there was a faint light of thought in her eyes. Ancient members of her race rarely showed any emotion outwardly, but Dylan was already beginning to realize that behind this apparent serenity, there were much more complex feelings. She was like a work of art herself, precise, cold, perfectly balanced, but there was a struggle going on inside her, as relentless as his. There was silence between them. There was no need for words. They already understood each other enough through teamwork and hardships. Every moment nearby, every look, every touch said more than any possible sentence. Their silence was not empty. It was full of taciturn but intense mutual understanding. They were doing everything they could to restore the ship's systems and give it a chance to hold out for a little longer, but now they could only wait. In that short moment, when the work was completed, they both felt a sudden emptiness. It wasn't just physical fatigue. It was more than that. The emptiness that arose after realizing that they had done everything they could, and now everything does not depend on them. Liriana remained motionless, her large dark eyes staring into the distance, as if she was trying to focus on something far away, something that did not concern their immediate problems. Her breathing was calm, measured, but there was uncertainty bubbling inside her, which she tried to suppress. The whole experience of being stuck on a ship with a man Sharing silence, loneliness, and fear of the unknown with him was unexpected for her. Never before had she felt so close to a being whose nature was so different from her own. Dylan knew what was going on inside her. Maybe he didn't fully understand her, but he knew that silence. He knew this alienation, this struggle between rationality and the emotional connection she was trying to suppress. He also felt something similar, but his human nature did not allow him to completely abandon feelings, the desire for connection. It was easier for him to recognize this strange attractive force inside himself that she was causing, even if his mind resisted it. Time dragged on unbearably slowly. Every second seemed like an hour. They could feel the tension from physical work slowly evaporating, but with it came another tension, the expectation of the unknown. The space between them seemed even more dense, even in the silence of the ship, which had now become almost absolute. They stayed close, but did not look at each other. Each was immersed in his own thoughts. But their connection did not disappear. On the contrary, it became more and more tangible. With every passing moment, Liriana began to feel something that scared her. It was inexplicable to her. It contradicted everything she knew about herself and her nature. She had always believed in reason and logic, and that was the basis of her existence. But now being next to this man, whose will to live and unyielding fortitude surprised her, she began to realize that her cold, rational consciousness could no longer fully control what was happening inside her. Her eyes moved quietly to Dylan. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, with his eyes closed, seemingly deep in thought. She knew he was thinking the same thing as she was. They had both been through too much to continue to ignore this bond that had arisen between them, but neither of them was ready to take the first step. For her, it would be an admission of weakness. For him, it would be an admission that he was no longer in control of the situation. Suddenly, something changed. A sudden noise made them both jump. It was a signal, a short, high-pitched sound that indicated that their distress signal had been received. They exchanged glances, not just surprised, but filled with mixed feelings. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Rescue was near. Perhaps it meant that their time on the ship was coming to an end. Dylan got up first, swaying slightly from exhaustion. He held out his hand to Liriana to help her up, and she hesitated slightly and accepted his gesture. It was a simple movement, but it reminded them both of those brief moments when their hands had already met, when they had felt that quiet spark between them. Their fingers briefly lingered on each other longer than necessary, and it was more than an accident. They walked through the narrow corridors of the ship, no longer as dark and frightening as before. The lights came on again, the life support system started working, and although they were still on the edge, the fear of death receded. At this moment, they were like two wanderers who had found temporary shelter in this endless space. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the metal walls, and every sound seemed to be a ghost of their own thoughts and feelings. The ship outside was still surrounded by the endless darkness of space. The huge stars, dispassionate and distant, stared at them with cold indifference. But in this small metal bubble stuck between life and death, there was something warm, something alive. It was their connection, though not yet fully understood, but already quite tangible. They reached the control room, where the communication lights were now flashing. Dylan checked the parameters. The rescue ship was approaching. It remains to wait a little bit before they are pulled out of this little hell that their flight has turned into. But now that the end was near, they both realized that with it came not only salvation, but also a new awareness. Liriana stopped at one of the screens, not looking at him. She knew that her time on this ship with Dylan was coming to an end, and it was causing her a strange mix of feelings that she couldn't quite understand. The fear of the unknown, of the fact that she would no longer be able to return to her old life, to the Liriana who had been before, cold, reasonable, dispassionate. Now something had changed, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Dylan, standing nearby, felt it too. He didn't know what to do. Their salvation was close, but it no longer seemed to him what he had been striving for from the very beginning. He understood that after this flight his life would not be the same, but the main change was not in what he experienced physically, but in what happened to him inside, next to her. When the rescue ship finally approached them, their eyes met. It was the last moment before everything changed again, and they both knew it. Their eyes spoke more than any words, and this silence was full of mutual understanding and recognition of what had happened between them. Salvation came, but their bond remained. The space outside the stellar whisper remained silent and endless, despite the proximity of salvation. The approaching signal of the rescue ship gave Dylan and Liriana hope, but even this confidence in their imminent release was fragile, like a thin layer of ice over a raging ocean. They knew that nothing was complete until they were safe aboard another ship, and even after that, they had to face new challenges. There was something alarming about the silence of the ship, as if the universe itself was preparing to deliver the final blow. Both continued to watch the approach of the rescue vessel through the screens, when suddenly the ship's systems malfunctioned. The monitors went out, the indicators blinked, and an unbearable expectation hung in the air. That time seemed to slow down. Then a sudden jolt swept through the hull of the stellar whisper, as if something invisible had collided with the ship, causing the steel walls to tremble and all systems to fail. Dylan and Liriana instinctively grabbed the nearest surfaces to stay on their feet. Then silence. Only the faint hum of the emergency systems broke the silence, as if the ship was trying to warn them that danger was still near. Both felt a sudden heaviness in their chests. Not only physically, but also psychologically, something went wrong, something broke, and they couldn't fix it in a matter of minutes. The nature of this danger was much deeper than they could have imagined. The cosmic anomaly, one of those rare and unpredictable ones that are rarely found even on the most dangerous routes, turned out to be much closer to them than they could have imagined. Watching through the windows, Dylan and Liriana saw how the space outside the ship began to bend and tremble, as if the very fabric of reality was crumbling before their eyes. It was something unknown, a phenomenon that before they could only see from a distance in textbooks or reports. But now he was here at arm's length, ready to absorb them into his twisted space. Emergency systems desperately tried to stabilize the ship, but to no avail. The lights flickered again, and Dylan felt the weight of the oxygen system begin to weigh on his lungs. The air became denser, as if the very atmosphere around them was shrinking. The stellar whisper was apparently dragged into the gravitational field of this anomaly, and none of their repairs could stop it. The first thing Dylan did was rush to the control panel. His fingers quickly ran over the buttons, checking the condition of the ship, but most of the systems simply did not respond. The mechanical sounds of the engines, which had seemed life-saving until recently, now sounded like the last gasps of a dying creature. Dylan knew that none of their prepared schemes or plans took into account such a scenario. Liriana did not move from her place, watching what was happening with an icy calmness that at other times Dylan might have perceived as indifference. But now he understood that this was her way of dealing with the situation. Her eyes were glued to the warping space outside, her mind trying to comprehend what was happening. Her civilization may have encountered similar phenomena, but never so close. She felt that the situation was beyond their capabilities. But her intuition, her acute alien perception suggested that there was still a chance. But this chance was minimal. There was no more time to think. Dylan knew that if they didn't make a decision in the next few minutes, the ship could be completely engulfed by the anomaly and no rescue vessel would have time to pull them out. His hands were shaking, but he remained focused, trying to figure out which way could give them at least temporary relief. The control panel blinked again. The gravitational fields generated by the anomaly caused constant failures in the systems, and this caused the stellar whisper to lose stability. Dylan rushed to the rear hatch, opening emergency access to the mechanical engine system. Their last chance was to try to use the residual energy of the engines for short-term acceleration. This could give them the necessary jolting force to temporarily move beyond the gravitational field of the anomaly. He knew it was a risky plan, very risky. If he made a mistake, they could completely lose control of the ship and fly right into the thick of the anomaly. But they had no choice. There were only a few minutes left before the anomaly would engulf them completely. Liriana watched him, realizing that man might have an intuition that she did not possess, despite her racial evolution. She trusted him, even if that trust was illogical from her point of view. She knew that her options were exhausted. This was their last chance. Dylan gathered his last strength, connected the backup cables, and activated the acceleration system. The hull of the ship shook with a sharp jolt, and they felt their bodies give back slightly from the overload. Speller Whisper began to gain speed, but it was far from salvation. They are not out of the dangers. The gravitational fields continued to pull them, and every moment seemed like an eternity. The anomaly seemed to attract them even more, as if playing with them, not letting go until the last. The ship's hull creaked under the pressure, and at that moment, all they could do was just wait until the gravitational field or acceleration leads them to salvation or death. And so after a few agonizing seconds that seemed like a lifetime, the ship jerked violently. The space outside the ship stopped bending, and the anomaly seemed to loosen its grip. They broke through, but this was not enough to completely avoid the danger. The Stellar Whisper continued to spin, losing stability. The ship was on the verge of destruction, but at least they no longer felt the pull of the anomaly. The stabilization system was activated after a few seconds. Dylan, feeling the ship coming back to normal, lowered his arms, breathing heavily. He still didn't believe that they had managed to get out, but at that moment it didn't matter anymore. The rescue ship was already close, and although their ship was still shaking, they already felt almost safe. Liriana, who had been standing nearby all this time, was closely watching what was happening. Her gaze was focused, but not on the technical aspects. Her thoughts were somewhere deeper beyond rational thinking. She saw it as the last test of their survival, not only physically, but also emotionally. Their connection, their cooperation, all this was tested for strength, and they coped. Stellar Whisper began to slow down. The ship was no longer shaking, and everything seemed quiet, almost calm. Dylan looked around, his eyes meeting Liriana's. There were no words in that look, but there was an understanding they had been through this together and it had changed them both. At this moment, there was no need to talk about how each of them felt. The rescue ship was approaching, and their rescue was no longer an illusion, but a reality. They had passed the last test of survival, and now something new was opening up before them, something they could not have predicted when they first met on board this ship. The outer space outside the Stellar Whisper has regained its usual calm. Silence, endless stars, immobility, everything that used to cause anxiety and a sense of hopelessness has now become a symbol of their salvation. The spatial anomaly was left behind, and the Stellar Whisper was slowly returning to stability, although its condition left much to be desired. Many systems were still operating in emergency mode. The hull was scarred and battered, and their energy was barely enough to maintain the minimal functions of the ship. The rescue ship finally appeared on the horizon, a small point of light that was slowly approaching them, like a light of hope breaking through the darkness. He moved slowly, cautiously, but confidently. This was the first evidence that their suffering was almost over. But for Dylan and Liriana, this rescue did not seem absolute. Yes, they knew they would be safe soon, but something more complicated and uncertain was going on inside each of them. The ship was approaching, and in its light, the Stellar Whisper looked even smaller and more fragile than they could have imagined. From the outside, it was just an unremarkable machine, but for those on board, it became an arena for internal struggle, a place where their destinies intertwined into something much more than just working together. Everything they had experienced on board the ship had become a part of their being, and this bond that had arisen between them was not just the result of circumstances. She became something they couldn't deny anymore. Dylan stood at one of the windows, watching the approach of the rescue ship. There was a mixed cocktail of emotions in his soul. On the one hand, he felt relieved that everything would be over soon. On the other hand, this feeling was strangely mixed with a kind of inexplicable. He knew that this moment, this stage of their lives was ending. The whole nightmarish and strange experience they had had together should have been left behind. But he also knew that by leaving Stellar behind, he would leave something more. That unknown and inexplicable connection that had arisen between him and his mind was trying to resist these thoughts. He is used to being a soldier, a captain, a man who follows order and duty. He used to think that every stage of life could be completed and moved on. But this situation was different. He felt that something had changed in him, something more than just a dangerous adventure he could not explain to himself why thoughts of Liriana did not leave his mind, why her cold, detached nature now seemed to him not a barrier, but something mysterious and attractive. He couldn't deny that something inside him didn't want to let her go. Liriana, sitting nearby, was also restless. Her sharp alien mind, which always relied on logic and clear analysis, turned out to be helpless in the face of a wave of new feelings and thoughts. She saw the approaching salvation and understood that it brings not only physical freedom, but also the moment when she will have to make a choice. To leave everything behind as she used to, as she was taught in her culture, or to admit that this event changed her. She couldn't ignore this internal conflict. On Stellar Whisper, they became more than just partners. Liriana tried to convince herself that it was just the result of stress and circumstances, that after they were rescued, all this would remain only in memories. But inside, she was seething with the realization that this was not true. She's changed. It was the first time in a long time, perhaps in her entire life, that she couldn't just take control of her feelings, drown them out with her mind. At first, she perceived Dylan as a primitive being, as a typical representative of the human race, who was too rude, too emotional. But with every day she spent on board, she began to see something more in him. His persistence, his willpower, his ability to overcome his own fears and doubts aroused her involuntary admiration. She understood that she began to see in him not just a person, but a person with whom she was not only interested, but also with whom she felt connected. Liriana didn't want to admit the connection. Her civilization and her personal upbringing did not allow her to enter into emotional attachments, especially to creatures so different from her race. But this situation was different. They've both been through things that can't be forgotten or ignored. And now she felt that their destinies were really intertwined. The ship was getting closer, and with that moment came something more: the need to accept the inevitable. Liriana got up from her seat and approached the window, standing next to Dylan. They stood side by side, silently watching as the rescue vessel made final maneuvers to dock with their ship. Those minutes seemed endless. Their whole lives, the decisions they had made, the moments they had experienced together, were now spinning before their eyes like movie frames. Every event, every moment was important because it brought them to this moment. Their fates were linked, and now they both realized that salvation would not solve all the questions they've been asking themselves in the last hours. When the rescue ship finally docked with the Stellar Whisper and the hatch opened, their faces were illuminated by bright light. Rescuers, dressed in standard protective suits, began their work, checking the condition of the systems, preparing them for evacuation. Everything happened quickly and smoothly, but for Dylan and Liriana, it was like a scene from a movie that unfolded against the background of their own inner experiences. Rescuers offered to help them, but neither Dylan nor Liriana felt the need for support. They silently followed them to the hatch, and before taking the last step, both involuntarily stopped for a moment. They knew that this was the moment that would divide their lives into before and after. They were standing side by side, but there was no longer the same distance between them. The ship was left behind, and the rescue vessel began to move away, taking them away from the anomaly and all the dangers they had experienced. But with them went something more: their old life, their old self-image. They could no longer return to who they were before they met aboard the Stellar Whisper. They didn't exchange a word, but there was a whole universe of unspoken feelings and thoughts in their silence. As the rescue ship plunged into the black abyss of space, leaving behind the destroyed Stellar Whisper, Dylan and Liriana stood on the deck, each immersed in their own thoughts. Their paths might have diverged, but now they knew that they were connected much deeper than just circumstances. Their fates were intertwined, and none of them could deny it. No matter what lay ahead, they were already inextricably linked by this strange and dangerous journey, which became for them something more than just a struggle for survival. Salvation was just the beginning.